Before I introduce the speakers, I was just going to say that we'll record the speakers and then turn off the recording for the discussion. If any of you have not been to the library before, a very warm welcome. Do join us. There are leaflets here. We've got a fantastic educational program, lectures, events. So do join up and take part in the activities. And if you haven't been to the previous sessions, look at them online. This is hybrid meeting, and most of our participants tonight are actually online, somewhat understandably given the weather and everything else. What we'll do is, when the speakers have spoken, we'll open it up for discussion. And at this point, obviously, you can raise your hands. People on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat, or obviously you can raise your hand, and we'll try to see those as well. But it makes it very easy if you put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll take them in turn. What I'm going to suggest we try this time, which is something a little bit different, is that when you ask your question or make your comment, if you actually come up here and speak, because that otherwise the question has to be repeated because the people on Zoom can't hear it. I think it might be much simpler, if people don't mind, if you just come up and put your question or your comment. Okay, hope that's all okay. Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Andrew Murray. He's a Morning Star columnist, a founder and vice president of Stop the War Coalition, and a former chief of staff at Unite the Union and advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. He's the author of several books, including Flashpoint, World War III, A New Labour Nightmare, Return of the Awkward Squad, The T&G Story, and The Fall and Rise of the British Left, and most recently, Is Socialism Possible in Britain? So a very, very warm welcome to Andrew. And then when Andrew's spoken, we have Kate Hudson, who will open up the discussion. And Kate is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, having served as chair of CND from 2003 to 2010. Her publications include CND, Now More Than Ever, The Story of a Peace Movement, and The New European Left, A Socialism for the 21st Century. So very amazing speakers, and a very warm welcome to you. I'm going to just move from the chair now in case there are latecomers so that I can let them in. So over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marge, and thank you, comrades, for coming out this evening, or those of you that have come out or logging on this evening for this meeting. Now, my title that I've been given tonight is Competing Imperialisms, A New Cold War, with a question mark. I'm not really sure that the question mark needs to be there the way we are now, since that seems to be what is clearly developing in the world today. Now, in what I'm going to say this evening, I'm going to build on the first lecture in this series, which was given by Kenny Coyle. I guess a number of you probably heard that, where he, I think, outlined the classical Marxist and Marxist-Leninist, indeed, theory of imperialism. Something which I'll touch on because I think it is something perhaps that we don't want to 100% take for granted, the way it was formulated more than 100 years ago, but it's still our guide to this subject. In general, we know imperialism is based on monopoly capitalism. It arises from the contradictions of capitalism, including the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the need for capitalists to find ways to counter that and to seek surplus profit, super profit, over and above the average rate of profit in the home market. Now, the definition I like to use of imperialism was given by British Marxist historian called Victor Kiernan. He's not as celebrated perhaps as Eric Hobsbawm or E.P. Thompson, but maybe he should be. Anyway, he said imperialism today may be said to display itself in coercion exerted abroad by one means or another to extort profits above what simple commercial exchange can procure. Now, that's a good definition of imperialism, but none of these definitions perhaps indicate what sort of political structure prevails in the world at any one time on the basis of imperialism. Broadly, there are three models, three ideas. The first is a world of inter-imperialist rivalry. That was very much the world in which Lenin was writing about imperialism. The model for that time is the lead up to World War I and indeed World War II with some modifications. It rests on competition amongst monopolies for markets and profit, and that competition been raised to the state level of the major capitalist states competing for territory and markets. That's the classical model. The second model is ultra-imperialism, which was outlined by Kautsky during World War I, rejected quite violently by Lenin and correctly at the time. But Kautsky saw the possibility of imperialism being superseded by an ultra-imperialism where all the imperial powers sort of fuse into one exploitative bloc. Now, that was wrong at the time, but you can see elements of that in the world today. Institutions like the IMF, the WTO, World Bank, the G7, attempts to coordinate all the great imperialist powers into a common policy. The third model is of super imperialism, where basically one imperialist power is so powerful it dominates all the others and runs things by and large in its own interests. That's the position that the USA attained in the capitalist world after 1945 and briefly globally after 1991. Now, none of these models ever exist in a pure form. Lenin said that the search for purity on the question of imperialism is basically a fool's errand. All these things are modified and interact. Even before World War I, the great imperialist powers cooperated quite a lot. They united to put down the Boxer nationalist uprising in Beijing, immortalized in the film 55 Days in Beijing. So they all could get on quite happily up to a point. Likewise, even at the height of its hegemony, the United States, as a super imperialist power, made room for other capitalist powers to accommodate their interests, sufficient at least to stop world socialism advancing. And it could quite happily underwrite, for example, the defense of Japan militarily and protect Japan, even when Japan was shutting out American imports and building up its own industries into a competitive position. So we can see all elements of all three of those models in the world today. Mainly, the US is striving to prolong its hegemony, the unipolar moment, with new alliances, particularly in the Pacific, like AUKUS and the so-called Quad, and through strengthening old alliances like NATO in Europe, trying to hold on to a super imperialist position against new rivalry. However, the change that there's been, which I think Kenny touched on at the end of his lecture last time, is globalization. Now, the key to all these models is different forms of capitalist accumulation, of capital accumulation, of ensuring super profit. And globalization has given new dimensions to that capitalist globalization. It's increased integration between markets around the world, and its removal of barriers to the free movement of capital is something which ultimately tends towards the equalization of the rate of profit between different countries, although that's a very long-term trend. but it's also sharpened rivalry as the whole world becomes a field of competition. It's in that sense, I mean, I'm only mentioning this possibly in passing, is that the weight that's been given in the past to the export of capital as a key aspect of imperialism is perhaps something that we need to reconfigure at any event, because it is now in the situation where there's an integrated market to a very large extent. The movement of capital from one part of it to another does not necessarily have the significance that it formerly did. The major exporter of capital in the world today is China, for example. You know, the movement of capital between what were regarded as underdeveloped nations and the metropolitan countries is certainly, I think, more complicated than it used to be. At any event, globalization hasn't put an end to imperialist rivalries. The US has generally become less accommodating to other interests, and there is no global state apparatus to mediate that rivalry or impose a redivision of markets or to regulate this competition adequately. There are those forms that I mentioned earlier, but they really don't play the decisive role in international politics. Because the US, I think, would rather be a super imperialist power, hegemonic over all the rest, than it would be to develop a sort of ultra imperialist system whereby all the capitals sort of merge or fuse into one structure. So if one's talking about competing imperialisms today, one has to start with the USA. It's the main imperial power. It's perhaps relatively declining, but its absolute power, measured in two key ways, first militarily and secondly in terms of currency, remain decisive. The US spends more on its military than the next 10 powers combined. And the dollar functions effectively as a world reserve currency, which, amongst other things, allows the US to run up huge budget deficits to sustain its military position without hitting the economic problems, well, let's say Britain did just last month when it ran up an unfunded budget deficit, or proposed to. And the US uses these two, direct military intervention or even short of intervention, a huge network of military bases around the world to intervene and intimidate, and also economic sanctions to try and impose its own interests on the world order and try and prolong its hegemonic position, which, as I say, is a relative decline because the rise of other powers, most obviously China, but even before that, the relative economic strength of the EU and Japan and so on meant that the United States' economic base for its hegemony, when it accounted for 50% of world industrial production in 1950, is now roughly half of that. Now, if you'd ask people about inter-imperialist clashes now, probably they would first of all look to the war in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine. There is debate, I suppose, as to whether Russia is an imperialist power. I think Kenny last time described it as imperialist or proto-imperialist, which seems about right. It's definitely moving in that direction. That Russia has a monopoly capitalist basis, I think, can hardly be disputed, and that it's been playing a more aggressive role in the world. The interests of the Russian elite has also something that's been going on pretty clearly. NATO has got behind Ukraine in the war with Russia, turning it effectively into a proxy conflict, where the interests of NATO are to, damage Russia as a rival, to either ensure it can't achieve its objectives in Ukraine, or it does so at a prohibitively high price. In saying this is a proxy war, there's only an equivalence in the Ukraine theatre, as it were, in terms of the world scale. The power that the NATO countries have, both militarily and economically, completely dwarfs that of Russia. So it's not a clash, as it were, of the 1914 type, when the major powers going to war were, taking one thing with another, roughly evenly matched. It's a grossly mismatched power, but it's an attempt of a new power, Russia, definitely a capitalist power, I would argue an imperialist one, to try and adjust balance in its own neighborhood in its favor. However, if we talk about a new Cold War, I think it's probably widely recognized this is much more directed at China. China's rise over the last 40 years has been remarkable. It's now possibly past the US in economic power, not GDP per capita, that won't happen for a while yet, but has become a significant international economic, military and diplomatic force. For a long time, the US hoped that China could be integrated into the world capitalist economy under Washington's hegemony, and that it would become a normal capitalist country in some way or other. It would merge towards Western norms of democracy. Now that project seems to have failed. It was probably always unrealistic. Again, there's a debate to be had about the nature of Chinese society. It still asserts itself as a socialist country with a socialist mission. All one can say for sure is that whether it's a capitalist country or a socialist country, it doesn't correspond to any of the models of capitalism or socialism that we really saw in the 19th and 20th centuries when those concepts were first forged. Perhaps that's not surprising. It's a quarter of humanity. And our concepts made 200 years ago in Europe aren't likely to survive contact with such a power with its own civilizational history unchanged. But its rise must, I think, make us rethink some of our definitions of imperialism. For example, it is a massive exporter of capital, China, but on the other hand, it doesn't seek to interfere in other states' affairs. But the Belt and Road Initiative has extended its economic influence enormously, and many countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, even to a limited extent in Europe, prefer dealing with China because of its non-interference and its relatively easy to deal with, to having the exploitative economic relations with the West, often accompanied by interference. Nevertheless, the expansion of Chinese economic influence does hit Western profits. It is competitive. It crowds US finance capital, its banks, and to some extent its industrial companies out of certain markets. China's also built itself up militarily to the point where in its own part of the world, the Western Pacific and the South China Sea, it can assert itself against the US, which still sees itself as the global military hegemon. And China's also tilted in the last 10 years back to state-led economic development and to themes like common prosperity and greater equality, which again, strengthen the argument that there is at least something of a socialist character in China. Although, as I say, resolving that question probably lies outside the framework of today's meeting. So the US is now seeking to block China's further influence. It's done this in a number of ways. One that directly impacts on us in Britain is the AUKUS Pact that unites the US, Britain and Australia in a program of nuclear escalation, giving Australia new nuclear submarines, a twist of the arms race and a challenge to nuclear non-proliferation in that area. There's also the Pentagon's general military tilt to the Pacific, moving away to a limited extent from the Middle East and definitely deploying its own hardware increasingly around China. Britain joins in too. When our aircraft carrier, the new aircraft carrier, went on its first trip, that was sent to the Far East, even though there's no obvious threat to Britain from that part of the world at all. The US is using aggressive economic measures against China, most recently, after escalating trade wars over the last few years, the virtual ban on semiconductors semiconductor chips to China, trying to maintain what America regards as a technological lead in semiconductor technology. This is absolutely vital for economic development. China has caught up substantially, but America is now trying to freeze its present lead by denying China access to semiconductors and threatening sanctions against any entity, not just any American entity, but any entity that wants to do any business in America that trades with China on this. There have been political campaigns over the Xinjiang Uyghurs and around Hong Kong. And there's also increasingly assertive support for Taiwanese separatism. So all that is going on in terms of the US confronting China. There is really no counter evidence of China confronting the US. It is simply China's rise as a power that is threatening to the US. Now, the Ukraine war is also leading to the US expanding its control in Europe. It's been used to get Sweden and Finland into NATO and to give NATO a greater purpose and focus. And the main thread connecting these initiatives in Europe and the ones in the Pacific are the US's attempts to maintain its sole superpower status. However, this is clearly fraying. Most countries, for example, don't want to support US sanctions over Ukraine. It's resisted by the major countries in Africa and Latin America, India, China itself, of course, and even in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has basically stiffed the Americans over this. They've not able, they not support sanctions. They've refused to cut the oil price to damage Russia and help the US economy. And it's just been announced today or revealed today that Xi Jinping is likely to visit Saudi Arabia for the first time soon. So here we have one of the pivotal powers in the Middle East distancing itself from US control. So we're having de facto a multipolar world now, where the idea that the whole world can be run from Washington or controlled from Washington is past. The main danger is the US mobilizing against China, encircling and undermining China, and of course the present war in Ukraine, where the rhetoric around it has already normalized talk of using nuclear weapons. It has to be said, rhetoric from Russia as well as NATO. But the systemic challenge to the US is from China. And one has to say, on precedent, that's unlikely to end peacefully. Taiwan is the most likely flashpoint, but no real hegemons have passed into history without conflict. Britain's position is as the most aggressive partner of the US. I mean, literally in the case of Ukraine, as aggressive or more than the Biden administration. And this isn't about culture or history or anything. It's to do with the role of British finance capital in the world, the role of the City of London, which has always depended on open capital markets. City of London launders the surplus value exploited from people all over the world. That maintaining that open system is not something that Britain can do for itself, as it could in the 19th century, but it's something that it can stand, that the US can do, or the US is the best shot at doing it, and Britain stands alongside the US. So to sort of conclude, comrades, the post-1991 world order is disintegrated. Imperialism is looking for a new basis for stabilizing and not finding it. The actual short-term solution to this lies in the recognition of a multipolar world united by respect for international law and a genuine commitment to disarmament. But this can only be achieved by the defeat of imperialist politics. And that's where the arguments around imperialism, the British Labour movement, are so important. They probably reached their peak of influence under the Corbyn leadership of Labour. But there's now been a fairly comprehensive counter-revolution in the Labour Party at any event, which was brought home to me by a guy called Wayne David, who Keir Starmer appointed his first minister for the Middle East and North Africa. It was interesting to appoint him to that job because he'd supported, as a Labour MP, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and arming Saudi Arabia and the intervention in Libya. But he was appointed to that job by Starmer, and then he said the Labour Party must end its obsession with anti-imperialism. Now, historically, no one anywhere in the world, outside possibly Parliament, thinks that the British Labour Party has suffered with an obsession about anti-imperialism. I mean, rather the opposite. But it's a battle that we do now need to fight anew. The importance was shown at the TUC, where the TUC voted narrowly, admittedly, and with lots of qualifications to campaign for increased defence spending. This is the logic of the Labour movement getting dragged into the war of competing imperialisms, getting dragged into the new Cold War, which will only be the anteroom to a hot war, unless we're careful. So it's time that we, all of us in the anti-war movement on the left, raised our game and underlined once more the importance of anti-imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That is amazing. Kate, over to you.
There we are. I hadn't been allowed to unmute, I don't think. Thanks very much, Marge, and great to see you and Andrew and the others whose faces I could see, but it's nice to speak to all of you. So, well, I think that was very helpful from Andrew. Some very good statement and really clear exposition of some of the key issues that we're facing. Things that I felt strongly in agreement with were the notion of the US seeking to retain its supremacy. You know, it had the unipolar world in the 1990s, the world's single superpower, and it's obviously striven to maintain that ever since, you know, through the both military and economic means that Andrew's been referring to. The kind of military and economic things currently are being aimed at both Russia and China. And of course, I absolutely agree that multipolarity is the way to go. It's the only realistic and possible way to go. And of course, it was great to see recently the victory of Lula in Brazil, you know, ensuring that once again there is a great emerging power in Latin America led by the left. And it may be that the BRICS countries will begin again to come up as a result of that victory. So I think that's been a very important political development. I'd just like, in my very brief few minutes that I shall contribute, to tease out some questions on what I think are some of the key issues. And particularly as I think that the debates on a couple of these issues on the left, the debates on the left about them are really obstructive to unity, particularly in for the anti-war movement, for the left more broadly. And that is this question of whether some countries are or aren't imperialist. And I think I've got a slightly different perspective from Andrew on this, but I'm not trying to put my view. I just want to raise a few questions to assist in the debate. So at the start, Andrew, you said you probably thought we didn't really need the question mark after a new Cold War, and I absolutely agree. We don't need the question mark there. I think I'd prefer to see a question mark after competing imperialisms, because I think that seeing it as competing imperialisms doesn't really get to the heart of some of the issues. So, for example, referring to the question of Russia, you know, and it's been quite hard to kind of maintain the unity that we've been used to around the anti-war movement with regard to the war on Ukraine. You know, pretty much. Well, there are some differing perspectives there, and I think very few people think that it was right for Russia to invade Ukraine, and I certainly don't think that it was right to invade Ukraine at all. But I think for me, it's a stretch to suggest that Russia was acting in an imperialist fashion in doing that. And I think also wouldn't really agree with the formulation that it's Russia and NATO, or Russia and the US, in conflict over Ukraine. What they're in conflict over really is the extension of NATO as a nuclear armed military state right up to the border with Russia. And on this occasion, Ukraine is, unfortunately for Ukraine, the site of that struggle. But equally in the previous decade, there was an issue around Georgia and whether Georgia should be allowed into NATO. So I think I think my preference would be to understand it like that. And in terms of Russia itself, it's got an economy that's insignificant in comparison to the US. Its GDP is roughly the same size as that of South Korea. Its defence spending is less than the UK's. In no sense is it a rising capitalist power. So all those kinds of things, won't go on about that too much. But, a lot of the time since the 1990s, it's been attempting to pull itself out of the semi-colonial status that was imposed on it by Yeltsin and the IMF. So I think it's more complex, really, than just describing it as imperialist. I don't know if anyone's been watching the Adam Curtis series Trauma Zone, which is on iPlayer currently. I don't necessarily agree with how he puts the images together and so on. But if you want to see how the former Soviet Union was absolutely devastated and brought down and destroyed by the introduction of capitalism, that's it, and it's BBC footage from the time, just absolutely extraordinary. So I think we need to understand what Russia is politically and economically, which is largely absolutely reprehensible. But, I don't think the imperialist term there is particularly helpful. And then also with regard to China as well, I pretty much agree with what Andrew was saying about China. But of course, again, this is something that is hotly debated on the left. And I was reading an interesting article about it the other day. What process is China supposed to have gone through to become capitalist or imperialist, as many on the left suggest? It's got a large market sector, but is that sufficient for given that the capitalist mode of production doesn't dominate within the Chinese economy, is that sufficient, having a large market sector, to then describe it as capitalist? I think a very interesting question to consider would be looking at the different economic paths followed by Russia and China. Russia to oligarchic capitalism and China to a kind of mixed economy that's lifted millions out of poverty. So it's some interesting issues around that. So I won't go on anymore, but I think delving into those, I think, are important because they do block constructive work from time to time in the peace and anti-war movement, in terms of our work against AUKUS and the kind of intensification of US-UK militarism in the South China Sea and the provocations there. You need to really understand politically what's going on as well as what's going on militarily. But big thank you to Andrew for such an interesting and useful presentation. And I'll finish there, Marge.
Before asking if Andrew would like to come back, let's just see, have we got any questions or comments in the chat? Or are there anybody here who'd like to come in at this point? One question?
Two, in fact.
Two, okay. Yeah. I think you need to read it out because I think Andrew and Kate can see it, but you can't see what the question is.
Stop recording.
Sorry?
Stop recording now. I'll stop recording now, is that right?
Yeah, please do. Okay.